Japanese luxury MPVs are being put on notice because the Chinese luxury MPVs are finally here, with the charge being led by this, the new Denza D9. Now, the Denza D9 is a luxury MPV by the Denza brand, Denza being a luxury offshoot of BYD. Kind of like how Lexus is a more upmarket brand next to Toyota, that's kind of how the relationship works here. Now, under the skin, you'll find a 103 kilowatt hour LFP battery, which on this front-wheel drive model will give you a WLTP range of about 580 kilometers, although that is a lofty ambition. In terms of charging, this car will accept up to about 150 kilowatts or 144, something to that effect, and 10 to 80% can be achieved in about 30 minutes. In terms of AC charging, this car will accept up to 11 kilowatts, which means a dead to full charge will take round about 10 hours. Now, obviously, in terms of performance, there is also the all-wheel drive model, which adds a smaller, less powerful electric motor over the rear wheels. But the vehicle that we have now is the front-wheel drive model. Now, between the two, there are no other specification differences aside from the suspension. The all-wheel drive model gets the active frequency dampers that we first saw from the BYD Sea Lion 7, whereas this car simply uses passive dampers. Aside from that, though, everything in here is just as you'd expect. Now, in terms of the exterior design of the Denza D9, this car is very much what you've come to expect from this segment. So there is a large waterfall-like grille, which is unique to the D9 BEV, which is the one that we're in now. There is a different one for the Denza plug-in hybrid, which we do not get in our market. Now, flanking those are a set of full LED headlights replete with automatic high beam. Although it is worth pointing out that while the headlight design is very intricate, replete with some copper-like detailing in order to make them stand out, unfortunately the indicators and the cornering lights live down on the bumper, which is not so bad on the front. Now, as we move down the side, rolling stock in this car is handled by a set of 18-inch alloy wheels with a multi-spoke design. Now, on the model that we're in now, they are wrapped in Continental premium contact tires. However, when you move up into the all-wheel drive, they upgrade themselves into Michelin rubbers instead. Now, the benefit of having these relatively smaller tires is that obviously there is going to be a little bit more ability to soak up lumps and bumps from the road itself, thanks to the nice thick sidewalls. However, I would like to point out the fact that to the best of my ability, I cannot discern whether or not these tires are unique or EV specific. And so if they are just regular standard tires, that's great because it should be cheaper to replace. However, because this car is knocking on damn nearly 3 tons, I do wonder whether or not those sidewalls will be able to last the longevity of the tire treads themselves. Now, moving down the side, it does reveal the fact that the Denza D9 is a massive MPV. This car is about 5.2 meters long, making it longer than what you get from a Toyota Alphard or Velfire. Notably, this car is also about the same height, but also a little bit wider, which means that space in here is significantly improved. And that's even before we touch on this car's absolutely enormous wheelbase, which absolutely dwarfs what you get from the Japanese competitors. However, compared to the Xpeng X9 and the Zeekr 009, this car is broadly about the same size, which means that you're not really trading much in one way or another. However, the Denza D9 does hold itself a little bit taller, at about 1.92 or 1.95 millimeters or meters in height, which means that it is low enough to get into a multi-story car park, but not so low that you can fit a roof box. Now, towards the rear, there are a few things about this car that I do quite like. I love the fact that the taillight design is very intricate and very distinctive. And they also integrate the indicators into a strip on those high-mounted stoplights, which is great because that's exactly what you're supposed to do here. Now, aside from that, there is a light bar in order to distinguish this car as a newfangled Chinese vehicle. And overall, I do think the back end of this car does look decent for a van. Now, when you do open the massive tailgate, you will find a pretty good amount of space. Even with the 3 rows set up for, human-sized humans, there is actually enough space in the boot for about 4 or even 5 cabin-sized suitcases. And of course, you can stack them further up if need be. Which means that if you have this car fully loaded with 6 or 7 people, you should be able to fit all the soft bags necessary in the back for a weekend away, making this a surprisingly practical MPV. Now, the third row, unfortunately, does not fold sort of into the floor the way we saw from the Kia Carnival. Instead, they sort of fold onto themselves and then leave a nice big shelf. That is not so great, especially considering the fact that the third row cannot be removed at all, which means that if you do want to maximize rear space, then you just have to put stuff on top of the folded third row bench. Now, the reason why I'm doing this review from this row is because I suspect that this experience is why most people would buy vehicles like this. Now, I'm not an MPV person. I'm definitely not a chauffeur-driven person. But being sat here in order to understand the experience, I can sort of get why people like vehicles like this. Because this is naturally larger than what you get from a luxury saloon. There is acres of space. It feels a lot more spacious and a lot more airy in here. And so I do get kind of why it is that people like this sort of thing. And as a chauffeur-driven vehicle, I will say the Denza D9 does do very well indeed, because life back here is pretty good. For example, there are a couple of powered and ventilated second row seats, which is always nice to see, and there's even massage functions for the second row. On top of that, I do have these little touch panels here which allow me to control a variety of different features within the car, including things like the sunshade, the air conditioning, even the music, as well as various other settings, which is certainly very nice. Of course, if you're sat back here and you'd like to relax, there is also a one-touch zero gravity mode, which puts you in a nice reclined position. But if you'd rather sit the way I am now, you also have access to these deployable tables for the second row, which are actually sturdy enough to even hold a laptop, and you even have USB-C ports in the second row in order to charge a MacBook, for example. Now, the dimples in here for like a phone and like a cup, yeah, they're not going to hold anything in place through corners, but that's okay because there is actually a deployable table here in between the two rear seats, which means that I can put a drink here, I can put my phone here, and wherever else I need to. And of course, if I want drinks, I can always just open this fridge and have access to cooled bottles, which is always nice to see. Now, this fridge is not just a fridge, because not only does it cool up to, I think, about 4 degrees, but you can also heat it up to some ridiculous degree, ensuring that if you have, say, a bento box, that can stay warm, although I much prefer my drinks to be kept cool. And as I mentioned earlier, in addition to having the USB-C ports, there is also 2 wireless chargers, one on either seat. There is also a cup holder somewhere here that I seem to have misplaced. It's down there on the doors, and there are also cup holders here, like I mentioned earlier, as well as on the back of the front center console, which means that practicality back here is pretty well catered for, which means that as a chauffeur-driven passenger, I am very comfortable indeed. My driver, or rather my video editor who's pretending to be my driver for this segment, is happily pootling along over there, and I can actually see the speed from here, which means I can throw this bottle at him if he speeds. But more importantly, back here, I am not bothered. I have air conditioning vents here. I can control my air conditioning like I mentioned earlier. And with a seat set up like this, with the front seat set up to broadly where I would sit if I were driving, I have a good amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the standard fit panoramic sunroof. And with the seat set up like this, there is still enough space in the third row for 3 adults, which means that, again, this is a very practical vehicle. Now, if you were to sit in the third row, you will realize that amenities back there are still pretty good. You still get roof-mounted air vents, you still get USB-C ports, and there's even a deployable center armrest in the third row, which means that if you just have 6 passengers, or 2 adults in every row, even in the third row, they should be very comfortable indeed. Although only the second row gets these nice sun blinds, which is great when you're trying to block out peasants you're being chauffeured by in. Now, life back here is good in terms of amenities, but in terms of overall ride comfort, it is a little bit of a hit and miss. Now, this could be, I will say, as a result of me simply not being used to being chauffeured like this, but it does feel like in this car there are a lot of vertical movements, as if the suspension is almost too soft in order to cope with this. I do notice that whenever there are lumps and bumps, the suspension is doing a very good job at trying to isolate the cabin, which means that the very worst of the lumps and bumps are very good. The secondary ride is what I'm referring to. But in terms of the primary ride, this car is not so great because it does feel like there is a lot of lean within this cabin, which is unfortunate, but also to be expected given the fact that this vehicle is again pushing on nearly 3 tons. However, in terms of refinement, life back here is pretty good. Because the windows are acoustic glass all the way around, there is very, very little noise that actually gets into this cabin. On top of that, because the wheelbase is so long, the wheels are pushed all the way to the furthest corners of the car, which means that once again, there isn't that much in terms of road noise. So life is decently good. I even have adjustable headrests here with side support, which means that if I want to have a nap, my head isn't going to end up rolling around, which is, again, always nice to see. Now, if you ask me, I think that life in the second row is clearly what this car is all about. And I think that it is pretty positive, because when you're just driving around about town, like we are now, life back here is serene, comfortable, and very well catered for. Although if I wanted to nitpick, it is slightly unfortunate that this car doesn't seem to offer any sort of rear seat entertainment. The Xpeng X9 as well as the Zeekr 009 offer a rear-mounted central screen in order to entertain yourself, or even do video conferencing should you so want to, whereas in this car, you're just kind of left to your own devices. However, because there is that sturdy table that I mentioned earlier with a USB-C port, you could set up a laptop there to teleconference if you want to, so that is certainly one option. Now, up front, you get a very large central infotainment screen which runs the typical BYD user interface with a light Denza skin on it, which operates the way we've come to expect and offers no surprises, but of course it also doesn't quite carry the premium feel that we'd expect to see. The same goes in terms of the instrument cluster. The heads-up display is reserved only for the all-wheel drive model, and the overall controls in this car are very predictable and very expected if you've ever had any time in a BYD. However, what Denza likes to point out in this car is the attention to detail, and one of those areas includes build quality. Now, all the materials in this car are of a significantly higher grade than what you'd expect from a typical BYD. So for example, even the fake plastic wood is now of a slightly higher grade. The leather is also a softer with a smaller grain, and the overall stitching and the overall finishing in this car appears to be of a higher quality from what you'd expect from, again, a BYD. But it is worth bearing in mind that the Denza D9 starts at about 260,000 ringgit, making it not that much more expensive than a Sea Lion 7 anyway. In terms of practicality, there is lots of space. In the front, for example, you have that floating center console where underneath there is plenty of space, as well as a USB-C, USB-A and 12-volt socket. You have a relatively large center console bin, which opens like what you'd find on a Mercedes-Benz, so it opens like that. And it is lined in felt. The same goes for the glove box on the dash itself, which is also lined in felt, so that anything in there doesn't rattle about and make too much noise. There are a couple of cup holders, there's a wireless phone charger. You also get a crystalline gear selector, which honestly looks a little bit tacky, but moving down into that center console does reveal a few things about this car that I'm not quite a fan of. There are a lot of physical buttons on this car, which is great. However, they all appear to be done in gloss plastic, and on top of that, the buttons for the doors as well as the fridge, etc., are all touch capacitive buttons, which means that not only will you have to press it quite intently, which leaves a fingerprint, but also we have noticed that at times you end up triggering the wrong button. It seems that the touch point in order to trigger the buttons is quite small, and so that can be quite finicky. However, there are at least real physical toggles for things like the drive mode selector, the regen, as well as the volume setting, which is certainly nice to see. Now, beyond that, we also have a new steering wheel in this car, which debuts a new two-spoke design for Denza, and it does integrate all of the physical buttons that we've come to expect from other BYD branded products, and so it does work again in a very predictable, very easy and relatively ergonomic fashion. In terms of ergonomics, the two front seats are powered and ventilated and even come with angle adjustment for the first time, which is fantastic, which means it is very easy to get comfortable in the front seats. On top of that, there is memory functionality not only for the two front seats, but also for these two rear seats, ensuring that everyone can get comfortable pretty easily. Now, life in the third row is just as comfortable, because while those might be considered to be the cheap seats, they are very well padded and very well insulated. So once again, road noise, wind noise is not a concern at all, and the seats themselves offer a decent amount of support, as well as a decent amount of under-thigh support, which means that even if you have to do long distances in this car, it shouldn't be a problem at all. However, the thing about the Denza D9 is, with its very pointed and very competitive price point, there is the possibility that these cars are not necessarily going to be bought solely by the people who sit in this seat, which means that now I have to sack my driver and do his job instead. Now, sat in this seat, my mind is now being thrown into the position of, say, a family man. If I had one too many children and I needed a bit more space, then to that end, the Denza D9 still makes sense, because sat here, while it does feel like a particularly large car, which I'll admit is largely down to the fact this windscreen seems to stretch on forever, in reality, it's not actually that hard to live with. When I picked this car up, sure, the first half hour was a little bit iffy, but then after that, I just got really used to it. On top of that, this car's fantastic 360-degree camera means that no matter what, you can always see what's going on, and so you're never left guessing where the corners of the car are. Now, if I were a family buyer, I'd appreciate the fact this car comes with not 2, but 4 ISOFIX mounts, which means that I could put baby seats all the way in the 3rd row should I want to. And in fact, because this car has massive sliding doors, it also means that bulky rear-facing child seats are suddenly not so bulky anymore. And being sat here, the driving experience of this D9, for lack of a better word, is best encapsulated by the word soft. Everything in this car is soft. The accelerator pedal on this car, for example, is soft. When you put your foot down, it doesn't sort of snap your head back the way you would in, say, a Seal Premium, for example. Instead, it sort of just gently gathers speed, which is kind of what you want from a vehicle like this. It is not about neck-snapping speed, it's not about the immediacy of the torque. It's about being able to slowly and elegantly gather momentum. And I think that the throttle pedal has been mapped in order to do that very well. And it doesn't change with the mode. Even if you put it in sport mode, it's not really that instantaneous. It just sort of gathers speed, ensuring that no matter what, you always look dignified behind the wheel of your D9. It also helps to ensure that passengers in the car never feel too rattled. And all the controls in here feel pretty decent. This steering wheel, for example, can be set to a sport setting, which makes it a little bit heavier. But for the most part, I've kept this in comfort. I've also kept the brake pedal in comfort mode as well, because it makes for smoother progress. And overall, this car is just very positive to live with. And then you get onto this car's fantastic safety features, of which there are many. Like every other BYD, this car comes as standard with level 2 semi-autonomy, which means that this car has things like adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, lane centering assist, lane keep assist, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, rear door opening warning in case there's traffic going by when you open the door, and stuff that you'd expect again from a modern luxury Chinese vehicle. There is one omission though, which I think is actually a good thing, because this car doesn't appear to have any form of retina tracking, which is great because the majority of your controls, like for your HVAC and stuff like that, all live in here, which means that you will be spending quite a lot of time looking here. Now, being sat in the front seats, I will say that Refinement is just as good up here as it is in the back. You still have that acoustic glass, it still cancels out a lot of that noise, but of course you now have more control over this car's standard fit Dynaudio system, which allows you to drown out even more of that noise with pretty decent sound. Not great, but decent for the money. And of course, when you're sat here, because you're sat so high, you have a very commanding view out, everything is just pretty good. It feels very much like a traditional MPV, unlike what we saw from the Kia Carnival, for example, which feels positively car-like in comparison. And then we have to get onto this car's energy consumption. Now, I did take this car over a long distance drive, about 300 kilometers round trip, keeping this car at a steady set 110 kilometers an hour. And in doing so, this car's rolling consumption average was about 25 kilowatt hours to the 100. Now, that is not a particularly impressive figure, because with this car's 100 odd kilowatt hour battery, that translates to a real world range of about 400 kilometers on the motorway. That's not so good. But I will counter you with this. The majority of vehicles like this spend their time pootling about in town, sending the kids to school, sending the boss to work, driving the boss's wife or mistress around. And so when you're just stuck in traffic, that's when an electric MPV like this makes a lot of sense. Because when I do drive about in town doing town speeds, this car will go as low as 17.5 kilowatt hours to the 100, which means that at that point you are knocking on, or in fact exceeding slightly, 500 kilometers on a single charge. Now, because this car has a massive battery, if you were to use this or charge it up at a DC fast charging station, you'll be paying about 150 ringgit for a full charge, which again translates to anywhere between 400 to 500 kilometers. Now, if you were to charge this car at home, that same charge only costs about 50 ringgit, which makes this car much more affordable to run than any other large combustion luxury MPV. And that is where I think these cars will really come good. Anyone with an Alphard or a Velfire today, especially the reconditioned ones, you really need to start looking at these Chinese MPVs instead. Because rather than spend 50 ringgit a day in fuel, you can get away with just charging this car up wherever necessary. And that's before we get onto the added benefit of the fact that this car can idle forever without really using that much power at all. Which means that even if you do have a driver, they're not going to be stuck sweating in the car waiting for you, or worse still, wasting fuel. These cars are immensely practical, and when you're stuck in traffic, there is no better powertrain than an electric one, because it's smooth, there's no vibrations, there's no harshness, there's no gearbox, there's no shift shock. This feels like a truly plush experience, and in fact, I would go as far as to say that this Denza D9, and by extension other electric MPVs, actually come pretty close to what a Rolls-Royce was like 10 years ago, no, 20 years ago, which means that you're getting a lot for the money. If you want luxury transport, this is basically it. And because the Denza D9 is now currently the best-selling luxury MPV in its class, it also means that spare parts are no issue. And because it's represented by BYD, you know that the engineering behind this is pretty good. That battery, for example, is not only warranted for 8 years and 160,000 kilometers, it is also a cross-border warranty, which means that even if you want to travel down to Singapore or up into Thailand, if anything, heaven forbid, were to happen to this car, you can just look for a Denza dealership and they will deal with it. And that is on top of the fact this car comes with a fantastic standard vehicle warranty, which means that it doesn't matter if you are the boss driving your own or being chauffeured in your own private vehicle, if you're a fleet buyer or indeed a family buyer, the Denza D9 appeals to all. And I really do think that this is a fantastically equipped package. If you want a vehicle that is perhaps slightly more distinctive to look at, there is also the Xpeng X9, which notably in its base model might not offer the same amount of range as this car does, but it also comes with an LFP battery, which means that you can charge this car to full every single day should you so want to. And of course, if you are the type of person who uses their large luxury MPV to cover serious distance on a frequent basis, then please continue to purchase Alphard's Velfires, or better yet, get a Kia Carnival, because that is the only large luxury MPV that will do about 7 liters to the 100 on a motorway run. However, if you are like the majority of users of vehicles like this and you spend most of your time stuck in urban traffic and just doing the daily grind, then a luxury MPV is the very best solution that money can buy right now, and they don't get much better than the Denza D9. In any case, that concludes our review of the Denza D9 Advance. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. All the links are in the description below. And please stay tuned because we are going to get the performance model in order to try that suspension. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.